Alan Bennett has been described, to his annoyance, as a national treasure, but he's certainly treasured by the National Theatre. The Habit of Art, dramatising an encounter between the poet W.H. Auden and the composer Benjamin Britten, is his third major play to be premiered there, following The Madness of George III and The History Boys, both later filmed. Bennett has worked in many other genres, as a comedian and actor since Beyond the Fringe in the 1960s, a prolific diarist, and a writer of television scripts, including the Talking Heads series of monologues. But every few years he returns to the theatre, although well aware of its drawbacks. The Habit of Art contains backstage scenes showing the irritations and difficulties of putting on a play. One of the problems with theatre, I assume, is that there are so many variables. There's a line in The Habit of Art: plays are not so much produced as they go into an intensive care. And for example, with The Habit of Art, you started with Michael Gambon playing Auden. He dropped out because of illness. It's now Richard Griffiths. So there are just so many things that can go wrong.
Well, it sounds awful to say so. It makes it more fun. It makes it more exciting. You know, television is much more ordered, whereas plays, you don't know what's going to happen. And but my experience here, I mean, at the National Theatre, has been so lucky, really, and so fortunate. I've had a good time on all the plays that I've done, and even this one, even with the initial dramas. I mean, obviously it's very sad Michael had to withdraw, but nevertheless, we're having a good time doing it.
You say in one of the diaries that there's something that happens in casting that after all the obvious possibilities have been exhausted, people then get more and more wild and ambitious.
They do, it's quite true. It was also quite funny with Habit of Art, because Michael, when he got to the hospital, 5 minutes after he'd left here, because it's just along the embankment, he'd already come round and was fine. And he said, "Oh, I know what's happening. They'll all be in the canteen recasting." And of course, he was quite right. We were, but it's a scene that nobody ever sees.
In writing home the first autobiographical volume, you're writing an essay on Larkin, and you say that you always feel like an imposter, someone pretending to be part of the literary world.
Well, I do slightly. I think it's also partly the way my career's developed, in the sense that literary people think of me as a playwright, and maybe the theatre, they think of me as too literary. I don't know. There's betwixt and between.
I inevitably want to talk about your childhood, and you've written a lot about it, particularly recently in the diaries and the 2 autobiographical collections, also telling tales on television, the monologues. But you seem to have incredibly precise recall for the details of your childhood, where certain items were on pieces of furniture. What people said. Is that all memory, or did you write things down from early on?
I think what happens is that you start off with something that you do remember, and then the rest comes back in the process. My memory is not good, but I do, you know, as you're supposed to do, remember much better things further back than I do recent events. But it was a very enclosed and uneventful childhood, so in a way there was much less to remember, really.
There's a warning in The Power of Art about quoting writers' words back at them, because it's bad form, but to some extent I have to do a bit of it. Your father, you described it, even the title of one of Telling Tales, a shy butcher.
Yeah.
You also say in that series that you, looking back, you loved your mother more than your father, or you were closer to her. But that is, I mean, those are things that you clearly recall. But your father, you also say about your father, struck me, he's very good at mythologizing people, giving them nicknames and so on, which is obviously is a kind of writer's instinct, isn't it?
Yes, well, and he was literary in a funny way. There used to be a magazine called John Bull, and John Bull had a literary competition called Bullets. And bullets had really pithy little phrases which summed up a situation. I never really understood them as a child, because Dad used to labour over these bullets. The prize was something like £50, which was, you know, unimaginable then. And he never won, but he obviously, his inclinations were literally slightly. And he did, when customers came into the shop, he could reproduce the conversation and make you laugh about what the customers had said.
And very early on, and that thing about hearing things, that quite early on in your career, a critic actually said he travels on a bus with a notebook, noting down things that people have said, which they were, clearly it was quite provocative of them to say this, but it wasn't literally the case.
I did used to keep notebooks. They'd be incomprehensible, really, but they're just little phrases. But I didn't. I didn't do it in an obvious way, so that they were a pretentious way that you were writing. I was quite furtive about it.
And the autobiographical ones, some of them just stuck, presumably. So, for example, when your mother said, when you went to France for the first time, she liked scent, although she never used it, and she said, get me some of that, Chanel No. 5, or if they haven't got it, No. 4. But that kind of thing just goes straight into your head, presumably.
Yes, but it's absolutely genuine, and she wouldn't know she was being funny. Sometimes she would say something, and she would know that it was she was getting it. She called the Arc de Triomphe. She called it the Trump Defiance. And now she'd know this wasn't right, but she'd say it because she'd know it would get a laugh. But on the other hand, she wouldn't have been able to say it was the Arc de Triomphe. I think probably as she got older that she was a bit of a character and played up to that.
And your relationship with your father, it seems to be in one of those quite classic English relationships that there was no hostility, as far as I can tell from reading it, but there's a very, very poignant scene in Untold Stories when he's dead, and you realise that you've never kissed him, and you don't know whether to kiss the body, which I think is a fairly standard English experience. But
he wasn't at all physical. I mean, even as a child, if you were kissing him, he would put his cheek out like that. My mum was much more, touched you a lot and hugged you, but Dad didn't. But he was very, very affectionate. They always said that the best time in their lives were when my brother and me were when we were babies or when we were small.
You're very hard on yourself, I think, in your autobiographical writing about your childhood. You often describe yourself as a snob.
Absolutely true, I was.
But you an architectural snob. You tell a story of not bringing a friend home again because your dad put a pan of dripping on the table. But where did that came from? There was some sense of class shame, or at least you were aware of class.
Yeah. Oh yes, very much so. Well, the house we lived in Headingley, where Dad had the butcher's shop, where we lived over the shop, and so that meant that the house was rather constricted, and so you came straight in from the street, from the back alley into the sitting or the living room. There was no passage or anything like that, and that seemed to me a source of some shame. And everybody else, my school friends, they lived in houses which were much more orthodox and more spacious, really. And so, when you're young, you are more conscious of these things. Earlier than that, when we were living in a different part of Leeds, we lived in the middle of a terrace, and you knew that the end terrace house was superior to your house because it somehow was semi-detached. And these sound like estate agents' distinctions, but they were very real for a child.
One of the stories in Telling Tales is about the unexpected, to me, influence of literature, that on the day war broke out, which used to be a comic catchphrase, but you were desperate to go on a picnic, which was an idea from literature.
Yeah, it was. Well, I think my parents knew that something was going to happen, and they told us we were going to go on a picnic, and I'd never been on a proper picnic before, and I imagined a picnic as a tablecloth on the grass and plates of sandwiches and so on. So we were going on this picnic on Sunday, September the 3rd, and we did in fact go on the picnic, and we'd already set off by the time Mr. Chamberlain was making his 11 o'clock broadcast. and we were going to leave, but my parents knew, they must have known, because they must have packed ready, but they were going because they were evacuating us. But we got to Leeds bus station, and there was chaos in the bus station, huge queues, and everybody getting out because everybody thought the place would be bombed flat. And eventually we got a bus to Harrogate, and I think we ate the picnic while we were in the queue at the bus station. That was it, and that's right. And I remember thinking that we never managed to be like anybody else. We always mess it up. But anyway, then we got on this bus to Harrogate, and then on to another one to Pateley Bridge, and then my dad, they just got off anywhere, and my dad knocked at the door of a farmhouse in Nidderdale and said, would they take us in, which they did.
And your years from 5 to 11, it's the Second World War, so you're from that generation. Yeah. But you've written about this, but Leeds pretty much missed the war, didn't it?
No, there was no, it was, again, you thought, oh, this is my life, we're never going to see the war. And there were no bombs, and there was no shrapnel, that was the other thing. Shrapnel, which is commonplace everywhere else, in Leeds was, like gold. And I remember we did get one piece, and I can still see the shape of it. It was about this long. I don't know what it was, if it was a bomb or a fuselage or whatever, but we just had this one piece of shrapnel. And I think about, there were only really about half a dozen raids on these, and they didn't do much damage.
One of the major things, clearly, that your upbringing gave you is Yorkshire speech, northern speech, and it's been much analysed. I mean, I grew up in Leeds, and so the characters are entirely familiar to me, but it's not just Yorkshire, it's also northern. Victoria Wood has talked about this, but there are certain things, there's a certain kind of attack in the delivery. They don't think, it's deadpan, they don't even think they're being funny, but it's inadvertently comic, and then often a crucial bit of information is held back to the very end after a pause.
It is that, and it's also, it's theatrical in its delivery, really. I'm conscious I've told stories like this so often, but my mum in later life suffered from depression, and she was often in Airedale Hospital near Keighley. And my dad and I had gone to visit her, and the hospital was built by Poulsen, the villainous architect. But anyway, it was a good hospital. It is a good hospital. And there's a long central corridor down the centre of the hospital. And we were going down this corridor one day, and it was empty apart from a woman coming towards us. And my mum said, do you see this woman coming down here? She's tried to commit suicide 3 times. Hello! and I mean, I've said before, but it's like restoration comedy, really. But it was totally natural, and it's what any northern woman can do instinctively, just lower the voice and conscious they're being overheard, and then make the situation socially all right.
But it's a fantastic gift for a playwright, isn't it, to have that kind of speech?
But yes, but I don't really think of it as a gift, but I suppose it is a gift. It's sometimes a handicap. I often put stuff in and then people say, what does this mean? And it's because I'm taking northern speech to be standard.
Tony Harrison, a Leeds-born poet of roughly the same generation as you, he's written a lot about the feeling that he was educated away from his parents by grammar school and then university. There's a very powerful line of his, I'd like to write the poems, I'd like to be the poet my father reads. Did you feel that in relation to your parents?
Yes, but I didn't. The danger is to write within that perception, as it were, to only write things which they would approve of, which I never did. They used to. My father died after my 3rd play, after Habeas Corpus, and I remember he came to see Habeas Corpus, which he would have thought rather cheeky, would be the word, I think. And I went round during the performance and looked through the little glass panel of the door, could see them sitting in the stalls, and he had a big smile on his face, but he was actually listening to other people laughing, you know, and I like that.
One of the things, I was always impressed that, in my view, you hadn't lost your Yorkshire accent at all. I was sent to elocution lessons when we moved south in order to get rid of it immediately. But then you said something, you talked about suffering an incurable disease of the vowels if anyone from the north who comes south. Yeah. But you are conscious of certain sounds.
Yes, but it's not the obvious one. The obvious vowels are long A's and short A's and Bath and Bath. But it's U's which are the really treacherous vowel. I mean, you catch yourself suddenly, and it happens sometimes in public readings when it's really embarrassing. You say butcher instead of butcher.
And you claim that the saintly Judi Dench smirked when you at your northern U sound.
We were doing a recital at Cambridge, and it was directed by Dady Rylands. So I was rather in awe of Dady Rylands, this survivor of Bloomsbury. And it's something about Garrick, and he's saying he took compliments from everybody, including and I can't say it, you see, the puff of a dunce, the first time I did it in rehearsal, I said the puff of a dance. So then Judi Dench becomes hysterical. And then when we actually got on stage and did it, the same thing happened, and I still got it wrong. And Dady Rylands was furious.
When you got to college, anyone who goes to university knows there are people who turn up determined to be actors or playwrights or to go into footlights, but you were much more uncertain about drama when you got there.
Yes, they all seemed to be much more accomplished than I was, so I never really... the college did plays, but I never was in them. The thing I did do at college was they had smoking concerts, which were just little end-of-term things in the junior common room. And I used to take part in those, and that's what I wrote the Anglican sermon that went into Beyond the Fringe for.
The other evening, I was strolling through Piccadilly Circus when my eye was caught by a rather personable young lady who was sitting there on a bench. And as I walked by, she called out to me, and she said, "Hey, Padre, have you got the time?" I had the time, and I stopped and told it to her, and she seemed most anxious to chat, so I sat down beside her on the bench. In the course of conversation, I laid my hand upon her knee, and suddenly she said, "Hey, Padre, what's the little game?" "Hey, Padre, what's the little game?"
You've had the, I don't know if it's pleasure or pain of being portrayed in a drama documentary about Beyond the Fringe, but the line taken in that was all these glittering, confident geniuses, Peter Cook, Jonathan Miller, Dudley Moore, and then this shy boy in a duffel coat who comes along and is quite baffled and nervous by it all. But was that in fact the case? Well,
I'm certainly the shyest of the four, though Dudley also was, although he wasn't shy really, but he also felt slightly in awe of both Peter and Jonathan, who in different ways both had immense verbal facility. And that slightly, I only realised after I'd written it, that slightly comes into the habit of art, because when Britten and Auden worked together when they were young, Britten was very much in awe of Auden, and the way Auden could just go into a corner and write a new verse if one was unsatisfactory. The fact that Britten could also do the same with music didn't seem to count, and that I think that reminded me of what it was like being in Beyond the Fringe.
You once said, which was a joke, I think, that you would never tell Jonathan Miller what you were writing a play about because he would have read every single book on the subject.
Yes, yeah. But I think we've taken it out now, but I think I put that in the habit of art as well. That Britten says nobody had ever been to Iceland until he did, you know, and Christopher Columbus didn't discover America, Whiston did, and it was slightly that atmosphere, really. But at the time, I felt that I was oppressed by it slightly and wanted to work on my own, without being sure that I could do. And Dudley was the same, but then Dudley teamed up with Peter and then sort of went a different way.
It was a very high level, it's perhaps hard for people to realise now, it was a very high level of fame and success very early on, and yet you're clearly shy. I mean, was that difficult to deal with?
Yes, but at the same time, it added to the pleasure of it, in the sense that if you don't have any sense of entitlement, if you think, what on earth am I doing here? That gives it a pleasure that you wouldn't otherwise get. I mean, just things like being in New York and being at a party, and at the other end of the sofa was Adlai Stevenson, and also, you know, meeting the Kennedys and people in that circle, and I suppose. But I didn't have anything to say. I just wrote home and said that my parents wouldn't have known who Adlai Stevenson was, but one also met all sorts of fading film stars who did really seem to be glamorous, because I'd seen them at the Picturedrome on Ridge Road when I was, 6, and people like Betty Davis and Humphrey Bogart and fabled names, and maybe my parents, because I was always used to what they kindly called romance, i.e. lied, when I was little. They maybe thought it was the same, I don't know, but one did meet all these people.
So what did the Kennedys say to you, or you to them?
Oh, they didn't. What happened was, they came round to the dressing room. It was quite ironic in a way, because there was some talk about that they weren't going to come round to the dressing room because on the stage we used a wooden rifle, and somehow this alarmed the Secret Service. Anyway, they did come round, and I was talking to somebody who I took to be a part of the inner circle of the Kennedys. He turned out to be a Secret Serviceman, so I didn't actually. I mean, I shook hands with Jack Kennedy. I think Peter. I may be libeling her, but I think Peter had an affair with Jackie Kennedy. I have an image of her standing next to Peter, stroking his arm in the dressing room, and he certainly went to parties with her.
Did you never ask him? You must have done.
No. But we were. It's quite funny about sex and things like that. We were all very. We used to know a lot about Dudley's sex life, because he didn't boast about it, but he was immensely promiscuous and used to tell us all about it. And we were all an avid audience, but we never talked to each other about the others. Never, I never said, there was never any hint that I was gay. They may have probably knew that I was, or assumed that I was, but it was never discussed in the way it would be now. Now it would be just accepted.
But it's a different generation, but for a long time, it was a long time before you formally came out.
Oh yes. But anyway, I didn't want to discuss it with them, really. If it was something entirely different. No, not until. Until I was really 10 years ago, I suppose, as late as that.
And before that, which appears in dictionaries of quotations, when Ian McKellen invited you in public to say whether you were gay or straight.
Yeah.
And you said it was like asking a man crawling across a desert whether he wanted Perrier or Malvern water.
That's absolutely true. If there was any sex going, you would go for it, but it didn't really matter which side it was on. There's been something of both in my life, but not enough of either, really. So, but I think most people would say that about their lives, I think.
Did your parents ever ask you? I mean, was there all that stuff about when are you bringing a girl home?
My father asked me once, And I said, no, don't be daft. And he was never mentioned again. But I always used to think, well, they were the beneficiaries of this in a way, because the fact that I didn't leave home properly till I was, what, 30, I suppose. And my dad didn't learn to drive till quite late, and so I was available to chauffeur them around and go to places with them, and really help them to have a nicer life, which if I'd not been gay, I wouldn't have been around, you know.
In Beyond the Fringe, clearly, and Jonathan Miller has spoken about this, I mean, he's quite embarrassed by the whole episode and wanted to do more intellectual things. But, I mean, clearly you wanted to write plays, and we're getting onto that stage of your career now.
The thing that I felt increasingly as Beyond the Fringe went on, and we did it for three and a half years, really, was that there was no gradation in the emotions involved. I wanted to do stuff which was, you didn't know whether to laugh or to cry, as it were, whereas Beyond the Fringe was just laughs, and that began to be restrictive, really. And I think when I started to write properly on my own, particularly with 40 Years On, I think it was getting into an area where you could laugh one minute and then it'd be not tragic but touching in the next, as it were.
40 Years On, which was the first stage play, that had started as a radio play, I think.
Yes, I wrote it and sent it into the BBC and didn't hear anything back about it. And then I managed to... I met Frith Banbury, an old-style theatre producer, on Primrose Hill, and I was talking to him about it, and he said, "Oh, send it to me," and so he liked it, but he didn't. He wasn't in a position to do it. Then he passed it on to Stall Theatres, and they had the notion of asking Gielgud to do it, which had never, I mean, beyond any ambition I'd had, and Gielgud, very much to my surprise, said yes, he'd like to do it. And so then it went on, and then about halfway through the run of 40 Years On in the West End, I got a letter from the BBC, producer at the BBC, saying, I found this play in the pool of plays. I think it might have possibilities. And so I had great pleasure in writing back and saying it was already on in the West End. Mm.
None of you boys here are old enough to remember that second war, nor even some of you masters, yet I remember them both. I can see myself now standing at that window one day in 1918 and listening to the rumble of the guns in Flanders. I stood at that window again in June 1940 to watch a lone Spitfire tackle a squadron of the Luftwaffe. Those times left their marks on Albion House. The older ones among you may remember Bombardier Tiffin, our gym instructor and corps commander, lately retired. The more observant ones among you will have remarked that one of Bombardier Tiffin's legs was not his own. The other, God bless him, was lost in the Great War. Some people lost other things, less tangible perhaps than legs, but nonetheless worthwhile. They lost illusions, they lost faith, they lost hope. That is why chewing charters.
Gielgud, it was a new departure, really, for him to play such a comic part. And he thought it was vulgar to begin with, and he didn't like to talk to the audience. And then he gradually got more and more confident. And you couldn't get him away from the audience in the end. He would lean right out over the footlights and look and see who was there, and loved it.
And were you in the presence of Gielgud, were you very diffident at that stage?
Not particularly, because he didn't inspire any kind of reverence, or certainly didn't make you nervous. The boys didn't know who he was, so they were perfectly, at ease with him. He talked all the time, and it would be an endless stream of reminiscence and extraordinary stories he would tell.
And it's broadly a what's now called a State of England play, or at least, and this has been subsequently, it's a recurrent theme, is what is England, what does England mean?
The end of the play is kind of, not prophetic, but it certainly is about the decay, the actual decay of the countryside, and just in the fact that England has lost its way, and the last line is to let a valuable site at the crossroads of the world, at present on offer to European clients, some alterations and improvements necessary.
And that aspect of the elegy for England in 40 Years On, there is, to me, obviously a connection with the first television play, A Day Out, which is set 1911, Halifax Cycling Club, and is about that, I mean, unbearable to think about, a period leading to the First World War and what we know will happen to these men. But what were the origins of that?
It was I was living by then in Camden Town in Gloucester Crescent, and round the corner was a street market, and there was a junk stall on the street market, Reggie's stall, and he had the prices for everything were sixpence or a shilling, and he used to sell. You come across old photographs there, which I used to get, and one photograph I bought was of a cycling club, and that's really what made me think about it. And then I didn't know how you wrote a television play, really, and I just started to jot down bits of dialogue and things I'd heard my mum and dad say.
You're not jiggered already, are you, Mr. Shuttleworth?
Just taking in the view, Mr. Shorter. Just taking in the view.
And got quite a lot of dialogue, and then sort of farmed it out among a group of characters, feeling this was somehow a bit of a cheat, really. I'm sure proper plays weren't written in this way. But anyway, it seemed to work, and then and I was very naive, because I thought, oh, well, if they go from Halifax to Fountain Abbey, but that's too far to cycle in a day there and back. I couldn't do that, and that nearly made me put it on one side. I was, so naive. But anyway, I finished it, and then showed it to Stephen Frears, who I knew socially, and he then showed it to Innes Lloyd, who was a producer at the BBC. And Innes liked it very much, and then sent it along to BBC Planning, and they said, oh, we don't like this, it doesn't go anywhere. And he said, well, it goes to Fountains Abbey and back. That's far enough for me. And so he did it, and he was then my producer for, until he died in 1991, I think. And he was wonderful, because he was so unobtrusive, and he was so loyal, and you never knew if there'd been any trouble with money or any trouble setting something up. And he was absolutely ideal in that way. He shielded you from anything just apart from, doing the writing. And I really, in a way, I haven't done much television since 1990, really, and it's because of that since he died.
One of the things writers have to do is to imagine what the next stage what might be like, the death of parents, old age.
There's a terrible inevitability about it. There's a story about Philip Roth sitting by his father's deathbed, and he genuinely moved and upset by this, but at the same time knowing that he's going to be writing about it.
Sunset Across the Bay, your second TV play, raises the ethics of autobiographical writing, because you've said that that's one you regret because too close to home. I mean, you were writing about your parents there.
Well, it is about, it's more about the man is more like my father and the woman is like my mother. It's about a couple who retire from Leeds to Morecambe, as people did, and thinking that they're going to have a new life, and of course they hate it and just long to be home. It was just at the time, we just finished the film, I think, when my father died, and he died of a heart attack, as the man does in the film, and so I felt, as one often does when you write, that somehow you'd called it down on yourself. And it's not even guilt, but you feel you shouldn't have done it.
You get some grand sunsets here. My mother always said the best sunsets she ever saw were at Morecambe, between the wars.
The monologue as a television form, which is something you became particularly associated with in the 80s, and it's now accepted, but there was quite a lot of resistance at the time. I mean, hence the title, Talking Heads, refers to the unease that people in TV felt about it.
The people used to say, liven it up, it's two talking heads. And I used to think, well, I like talking heads. I like watching people just talking. And I wrote the first one, which wasn't part of the series, called A Woman of No Importance, really for Patricia Routledge, about a woman very much based on my Auntie Kathleen, really, about a woman who's so totally self-centred, and you gradually realise she's dying, and follow her right through until she dies. This worked as drama, really, and Innes Lloyd, again, he wouldn't hear any objections to it, and so they did it. And then, having seen that worked, I then wrote another 6. People imagine that it's somehow to do with stream of consciousness, or to do with unpacking something that's in your head. And they aren't. They are actually action plays. A lot goes on, but it just happens off stage.
Writers spend most of their time not writing rather than writing. We imagine them working away all the time, but there are long, long periods where nothing happens.
I seem to write plays at, it's quite depressing, it's so long, at 4 yearly intervals, really. And the time when I'm trying to think of something to write is the one when I feel desperate, really, and want to give it up, because then you really feel it. You come to the end of a day and you're weary with it, but you haven't actually done anything. And then when I eventually decide what to do, it generally takes me about 2 years, really, to do it.
This is the third play in a row here, directed by Nicholas Heitner. We had the Madness of George III, History Boys, and now this, The Habit of Art. It's not an official trilogy, but there are links, I think, in that they're all plays about education in some ways. They all come from learning, I think, in your past, music, art, history. I
can see how the History Boys and this play lead on from one another, because Hector in the History Boys is a great fan of Auden, and he's always quoting Auden to the boys, and then the boys are saying, "Oh, that was gay, wasn't it, sir?" You know. So in that sense, there's a link. But I don't think I noticed it. That's what happens when you're writing. You don't notice your preoccupations until you actually finish the play. There's a character in this play who kept coming up in half a dozen plays I've written, and it's a figure who represents something about me, which is a mystification with education, with books, which I don't really quite see why I have, since I've had a very good education. I suppose I'm reasonably well read, but nevertheless they crop up.
The Habit of Art is very strongly about this. What right do we have to dramatise somebody else's life? How do we make clear the bits we've made up and the bits that are real? And The Habit of Art takes on all those questions.
Britton and Auden had collaborated quite early in their lives, and very successfully, and then they'd, I don't think quite quarrelled, but they'd certainly drifted apart. And then Auden had returned from America to England at the end of his life, and had been put up in Christchurch in Oxford. thinking he was going to have a nice, cosy old age, and it wasn't like that at all. He hated it. And it was the same time that Britain was also ailing, was writing Death in Venice. And somebody said, and it was in Humphrey Carpenter's biography, that Auden would have been the ideal person to write the libretto. And so I had the notion of Britain coming to see Auden and talking to him about it.
And what you're dramatising in that big encounter, the meeting between Britain and Auden, which didn't happen. Now, many playwrights have done that, but I think it's your history student side, you're scrupulous about it. So rather than just dramatise it, you use this framework of a play within a play, actors playing them, which I assume it's a way of saying this isn't, it allows you to comment on what is true and what isn't.
Well, yes, it does do that, but it didn't really come about like that. It came about because I originally wrote a play just about Auden and Britain. I found that there was an enormous amount of information which had to be passed to the audience, which it was very hard for them to do because they both knew it. So they were telling the audience something that they knew already.
Which does happen in bad biographical plays.
Yes, I know.
People will say, as you know, I've just written I've written my third novel, yeah.
Yes, it's terrible. But so I didn't want any of that. So in a way, I then put this other frame around it in making it a play within a play, so that the actors playing the parts could say, did he really pee in the basin, or did he really do this or say this? And so then they can have the discussions about the material in the rehearsal form. So that's how that happened. But I like biography. I mean, it's one of the things I like reading.
And that is a key scene in the play when the suggestion, which is clearly true, I think, that Britain, in writing Death in Venice, was getting too close to something at the time would have been scandalous to a huge degree, which was his interest in boys.
Yeah, yeah. And that's been more, since he died, it's been more talked about.
In fact, there was a whole book about
yes, that's
Britain
right.
about
well, it's called Britain's Children, but it's not really Britain's Children, it's Britain's Boys, really.
The whole business of public-private in your life and what you would give away. I mean, it's this issue of what privacy means. I mean, for example, in the case of the death of your friend Russell Harty, you got very publicly angry about the level of intrusion.
Well, because I saw it at close quarters. I mean, when he was ill in hospital in Leeds, one of the Murdoch papers hired a room opposite, and a cameraman was there with a long lens trying to get pictures into the ward, and then one of the reporters smuggled himself into the ward claiming to be a junior doctor, just to make sure that as they were insisting he had AIDS, which he didn't. He had hepatitis B, which of course in their book is just as bad, but the notion that an illness should be bad is monstrous. But no, and I'd never seen it really at first hand before, and it's left me with a hatred of the Murdoch press and of Murdoch, and the most recent developments. I mean, the fact that Fox News can put out such lies about the health service, and then the junior Murdoch can come to Edinburgh and lecture the BBC about its standards, seems to me really, it makes you sick, really. It's so awful. It's why I was offered an honorary degree at Oxford, and I turned it down because Oxford had taken, and indeed I think lobbied for, Murdoch's money to set up a communications institute which bears his name, and I can't. Nobody in Oxford seems to be bothered by this, but it still seems to me a slur on the university, really, that there is such a place.
But it's, as you pointed out in the address at Russell Harty's service, it's one of the complications of England. He was a Murdoch.
Yes, no.
He was a Murdoch columnist.
Yes, no,
Russell
that's
Harty.
right. It would be hopeless in a way to take moral stand on behalf of Russell, because he was amoral, really, and he would. He'd go anywhere where he thought he'd have a bit of fun, really. So I know I realised that, but all his friends would understand that. But nevertheless, it was the contrast between the sitting in intensive care in the hospital in St James's in Leeds, and seeing the dedication of the people on the ward and fighting for his life, and then this terrible business, these people outside. And of course Russell was totally unaware of that because he was unconscious.
People often don't take on the tabloid press because they fear that they will come for them. I mean, there is a kind of implied blackmail. Did you ever fear that?
No, because they did in the end. I mean, absurdly. I mean, because I had a relationship with Anne Davis, who she died this year, but she lived next door to me in Yorkshire, and I knew her in London. And the press got wind. I think it was the Mail this time. They got wind of it, and somehow they then outed me as not being homosexual. And it was just absurd, that you were somehow you weren't allowed not to be allowed to be something that they didn't expect you to be. And so there were these people out opposite the house in London, and I was there are Venetian blinds, and so I could see them, and they'd come and knock at the door, and then go away again, and they'd come again and knock at the door, and then a rather sad youth from the Mail put a little note through the door saying, "Mr. Bennett, I want to tell your real story." But it was just, and that didn't really upset me because it was so ridiculous. But that was just because I'd happened to, I think it was almost half a sentence in the New Yorker, in an interview I'd done with the New Yorker, I mentioned Anne, and they picked up on him.
Well, I was going to ask about that because you have gradually given more and more away over the years, haven't you? You think, well, what was one hiding it from? Who cares anyway? And particularly nowadays. But the untold stories came about where I do talk about it, and I do talk about how I sort of realised that I was gay and what it was like when I was young. That came about because I was diagnosed having cancer in 1997, and the prognosis was very poor, and so I thought I had a very short time to live. So I then started to write really autobiography, really, and I found it quite easy to write. It was quite helpful to write in a way. I just used to sit outside on a long chair and write this stuff, and I didn't get screwed up about a plot because I knew the plot. It was my life, and so all that I was able to tell, really thinking that I wasn't going to be around when people read it. But then as I then finished the book, and I realised I was going to be around, and I had to face that whether I wanted it to go out. And I thought, well, I don't really care anymore. So that was what. And I think in Untold Stories, subsequently your surgeon tells you that the odds were even worse than you thought.
Yes, no, the odds were 5 to 1, I think, against my surviving. But it apart from the mental anguish of it, the actual physical side of it, I had chemotherapy. It was boring, but it didn't. I wasn't disabled by it, and I still have to go for regular checkups. And the oncologist said that he recommends the book to people who are bothered about chemotherapy because it is fairly, straightforward about it and encouraging about it, really.
Michael Palin, in his diaries, he quotes you as saying that you were worried that you'd started living for your diary. That you were...
No, but you do find yourself thinking, oh, this will make a good entry. Even terrible things like cancer, some of the things. and that's why, in a way, it's a great blessing to be a writer, because there's always you think, well, I can always write it down, and that does well, dull the pain, really, and some things are funny, and you want to preserve them even in terrible circumstances.
There's a line in The Habit of Art about that writers fear biography. Do you fear it? I mean, it has happened to you once in your lifetime. It may happen subsequently.
No, not really. I just, there's nothing I haven't written about myself. I mean, that's, and in a way, that's another reason for publishing autobiography. You get in first, and you get your version in. I think people will find out that you're not as I'm not as cosy as they imagine.
I was going to raise the coziness charge. Michael Palin has also had it, but you were described as the Queen Mother of English literature, and although the biography of her suggests she had an acid streak as well, but and then described by the Independent Sunday as winsome.
Yes, that's right.
Leading you, now you do this punchline, leading you to send them a postcard, cancelling an interview, saying...
Winsome, losesome. Yes, I was very pleased about that. Yes.
You've just celebrated your 75th birthday. There are two attitudes to these landmark anniversaries. Some people just say it's just another birthday, and other people see it as a great, significant moment when they issue advice to the younger generation. So which do you see it as?
I don't think I can issue advice. I've felt it. It had a psychological effect on me. I do think, oh, I'm 75. And even in things like when I was coming here, I got the taxi to drop me off on the bridge, and I came down the steps, and then I thought I was coming down the steps. I thought, I have to be careful of steps now. I'm 75. But I have no lessons from life to offer, I'm afraid. I like the fact that when you're older, you can more or less say what you want, and I'm not concerned about making a fool of myself as I used to be most of my life, really. I don't care anymore.
You've always been politically quite hard to place, I think, for people, because when they read the diaries, when they read your articles, there's a kind of nostalgia which is traditionally associated with the right for the old Anglican prayer book and for architecture, and yet they're also very progressive concerns. But you've broadly been on the left in your life.
No, I think writers, particularly, you see, I mean, with Larkin and with Amis and with Iris Murdoch, that they begin on the left and then end up on the far right. With me, it really has gone. I've gone the other way, and I'm quite happy to have done so. When I was 17 or 18, I was very religious, very conservative with a capital C, and really unpleasant, I think. In memory, and then I think going in the army altered it, and then there's been a slow progress towards the left ever since. I mean, not to the organised left particularly, but I just feel more radical now than I was when I was younger, and I'm very glad to be so.
But you've written about this, but one of your regrets about New Labour was that they adopted, particularly in education, they adopted Tory ideas.
I was state educated myself throughout, and my parents never had to pay anything and so on. And maybe because of that, but I've always felt that private education is wrong. And all the arguments just resolve into one question: is it fair? And it seems to me that the answer always has to be, no, it is not fair. And then people say, oh, well, nothing is fair, but that's not an answer. And it seemed to me that certainly at the start in 1997, when they came in with such a massive majority, they could have done what they should have done in 1944, which is to take steps to amalgamate private education and state education if only at sixth form level, because that seemed to me to abolish public schools would be socially divisive and impossible to imagine. But at the same time, they could have made a start, and it would have been entirely possible. But there was no inclination to do that, and that saddens me. And some of when I write plays, I often think I'm writing the play simply in order to be able to write the introduction to it. And so in the introduction to the History Boys, this is all set out. They aren't quite on the scale of Shaw's introductions, but nevertheless, I do put stuff in which are slightly more heartfelt than is in the play, and stuff about being opposed to private education is in there.
And have you been courted by our leaders to any extent? I mean, have there been invitations to Chequers and Downing Street?
No, I've been to Downing Street once. I was never asked by Tony Blair. Gordon Brown, I went to Downing Street for a reception in aid of Fanny Waterman's Leeds Pianoforte competition. And I very much liked Gordon Brown and felt that if he could only show the private face in public, then his fortunes would be very different. But I don't know, he seems unable to do so. I don't think I'd be, if as I fear, the Tories get in at the next election, I don't think I'll be courted by them very much.
Alan Bennett, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Talking Heads, Alan Bennett's acclaimed monologues. Watch all episodes on BBC iPlayer.